Also, where's the little clicker?
Oh, it's
yes.
Yes. Showcase your extended moment.
No video now, you crazy bastard.
Okay. Maybe it's okay now. Okay. Hi guys. I'm actually really glad that I'm going after Jenna because her talk sort of leads into mine really nicely. So she gave us a way of understanding how we perceive the world through voluntary changes that we can make, and a way that we can make deliberate choices to shape the way that we perceive reality. What I want to talk about is a way in which we actually do this in an unconscious way, a way that we are not aware of, with the use of language, actually. I'm going to try and convince you by the end of this talk that the way that you use language actually shapes visually what you perceive when you look out into the world, at least in terms of color. So you can tell me at the end whether you're convinced or not. This is where I want to start. I want you to imagine that there's been a house fire. Everyone got out, no one's hurt, so don't worry about that. But there was a fire, and it was at your house, and so you're standing outside, and you have to describe to the policeman what happened. You have to describe how you think the fire happened, the way that the house was set up before the fire happened, and the way that that might have led to the fire. Okay, so I'm going to give you like 10 seconds. Think of that, the language you might use to describe it. I'm going to do the same thing. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. So this was Benjamin Wharf's job. He worked at a fire insurance company. And this is what he did all day, every day. He listened to people's testimonies, people who had gone through fires either in their homes or in the workplace, listened to their testimonies about what they think led to the fire, how they think the fire broke out, what the details were. What he starts to realize is that he notices certain patterns between certain language that people use to describe the circumstances and their beliefs about what they thought led to the fire and what happened in the fire. So he starts to make this correlation between language people use to describe their world and their beliefs about the way that the world works. So he becomes really interested in this topic of the connection between language and perception. And he goes on to start studying anthropology. And one of his most famous works in anthropology is with the Hopi Indian tribe in Arizona. So he goes and lives with the Hopi people for 2 years, studies their language. He wants to study their language to see if he can determine any sorts of significant differences in the way that they describe the world that might lead to different worldviews. The primary thing that he focuses on in his studies is the way that they describe time. He comes up with this theory that because the Hopi language describes time in a different way than we're used to, it's a sort of, they describe it in an entirely different way, the way that they use tense and the language, everything. He thinks that this leads them to actually have an entirely different understanding of the way that time works. He thinks that the language they use has led them to have a totally different worldview than we have. This is a pretty revolutionary idea, right? Because we think that, whatever, we're all people and we all just experience the world as it is, right? So it really sort of gets people's attention when he first comes out with this. It catches on a little bit at first, but largely he's actually really pretty much criticized for his views. So people are like, wait a second, like, who are you? You're not a linguist, you're not even really like a professional anthropologist. You just decided to go live with the Hopi tribe and study their language, and you're making all sorts of crazy assumptions that you really don't have the right to make. You don't have enough evidence to say that, okay, their language is different, you don't know that that means that they conceptualize time differently, how can you even measure that? So this becomes really criticized at first. And the dominant view that takes over for a while in the wake of this criticism is what's called universalism. So what Whorf comes up with is called linguistic relativity, which is the idea that language shapes reality, shapes our perception of reality. And the opposing view is called universalism. So what universalism says is that language is universal, and so is thought. There's some sort of non-linguistic basis to the way that we understand the world, and this gives rise to the way that we use language. And they study language. There's a lot of universalists claim that there are inherent structures in language, in all human language, and that means there's really no significant variation in worldviews as a result of these differing languages. Okay, so these are the sort of two feuding camps. We've got universalism and linguistic relativity. So universalism was really the most popular view for a while. Steven Pinker, Noam Chomsky, these are some famous universalists. study on it. And people have tried to sort of quantify ways that we could maybe measure how this might be taking place. It's a little hard. One of the problems with Worf's study is that time is a complex idea, and it's a complex thing to study. It's a little harder to zero in exactly on what someone's conception of time is. So people have shifted their attention a little bit to color. There's been a lot of study on color perception. So one of the most influential studies that's been done was done at UC Berkeley in 2006, testing for something that's called categorical perception. Okay, so what categorical perception is, I'm going to try and hammer this in as well as I can because it sort of lays the groundwork for the rest of what I'm going to talk about. Categorical perception is the idea that if we have objects or entities or something that are, for example, I'll actually use this example here of the little pointer here. This little dad right here. Okay. So these are 4 different objects. We'll call them objects because they're different colors. These are equally spaced apart on the spectrum. So if you had a spectrum and you looked at the sample from where they were taken from, they're all equally spaced apart. So there's no more difference between these two than there is between these two, or between those two. Yeah, this is way more stuff than I did. Okay. But categorical... You're like a pro with your pointers moving on. So what categorical perception says is that we will distinguish 2 things that are of different linguistic categories in a different way than we will distinguish ones of the same category. So if categorical perception is true, for example, here, this one and this one are no more different than these 2 are, but we're going to perceive these as more different than the ones that are in the same category. Does that make sense? Yes. So this is what they're testing for in this study that they did. So what they did was, and the importance of that, the reason that that matters is that if that's true that we do distinguish between categories differently, that means that there's something other than just the stimulus itself that we're seeing difference in. We project a difference that maybe isn't there in the stimulus itself. Okay, so what they did was they set up this experiment on the right there with a circle, and the subjects had to look at this little cross in the middle, and they were shown a circle with blocks of color around them, and one of the colors was different from the other ones, okay? And they gave the subjects a little left clicker and a right clicker, and you stare at the cross in the middle, and they show you the circle, and you have to click left if the different squares on the left, and right if the different squares on the right, and they measure your response time. What they showed was a couple different things. First of all, they showed that this idea of categorical perception does actually take place in our perception. So when the subjects were shown a circle with all green and then one blue, they perceived that faster, the difference faster than they perceived if they were all dark green and then the one was light green, okay? So this shows that we do actually perceive things that are of different linguistic categories differently than we perceive the ones in the same category. The most interesting thing that they found, though, was that the effect was different depending which of their visual fields they were looking at. So if it was on the right, they reacted differently than if it was on the left. So what they saw was that in the right visual field, so if it was on that side, they responded faster than they would if it was on the left side. Now why would that be? Well, this is your brain. This is how your brain works. Okay? I'm giving you all you need to know about neuroscience right here. It's like you have 2 hemispheres, okay, of your brain, left and right hemisphere. Everything that happens on the right side of your body, including your right visual field, is controlled by your left hemisphere. Everything on the left side of your body, including your left visual field, is controlled by the right. Right? So the hemispheres switch their influence. Okay? So, what they thought was that because the right visual field had a faster response, particularly with the categorical perception, there's a greater difference between between categories and within categories. For the right visual field, they thought, okay, well maybe it has to do with the fact that the dominant language center in the brain is in the left hemisphere. So maybe it's connected to language, and maybe the way that we process visual color is connected to language, and that would affect why it's different in one hemisphere than the right hemisphere than the left. That seems like a huge jump, right? I just made an enormous assumption. What if there's something else going on in the left hemisphere? What if it has absolutely nothing to do with language? We have no reason to believe that that is the case, right? So let's narrow it down even further. They repeated the test. And this time they distracted the subjects with a verbal task of some sort. So they had to do something, for example, like recite a series of letters or numbers or words in their head as they were doing it, okay? And what they saw was that when they did it without the test, in the initial experiment, the categorical perception effect happened largely in the right visual field, much faster than in the left visual field. With the verbal task distraction, that effect disappeared. So they did not have the same effect once they distracted them with the verbal task, right? So that seems to support this idea that maybe it has something to do with language, if that goes away when you distract your language faculties, right? But there could be something else going on. Maybe it's just sort of distracting in general to have a distraction that you can't focus on a task, no matter what the distraction is. Maybe that's just because they were distracted in general. So they did the task again, and they distracted them this time with a nonverbal task, something that was not occupying their language faculties. And the effect didn't happen that time. So when they distract them with a verbal task, the categorical perception effect is drastically lowered when it was present in the first place. But when they distract them with a nonverbal task, this doesn't happen. So this really seems to zero in on this effect of language on our perception of the world. Water. Okay. But here's where it gets weird. So in the initial task, it wasn't just that the categorical perception effect happened just in the right visual field, with the left hemisphere of this language, right? It also happened in the other visual field. It just took a little longer. So why would that be? If it's still happening even in the non-linguistic hemisphere, doesn't that mean that there's something that's non-linguistic about categorical perception? What do you think happened? So here's what they think happened here. Because it still happened in the left visual field in the right hemisphere, which is the non-language side, it just took a little longer. What they think maybe is happening is that the two sides of your brain have to talk to each other before you can process this information, okay? So I said that you have two hemispheres of your brain, they're split right down the middle. There's a structure right in the middle called the corpus callosum. Those of you who are in neuroscience should know that, or psych. And this is the primary structure that allows the two hemispheres of your brain to talk to each other, okay? So they think that maybe the reason that it's still happening on the other side, it just takes a little longer, is because there has to be a little time for the two sides of your brain to talk to each other and the language center to communicate with that side, right? So they did the test again, this time with subjects who were patients of split brain procedure. Not specifically for this experiment, they had the procedure for other reasons. Okay, we're going to cut your brain right down the middle. So this procedure is done primarily for people who have seizures. This is the way treating seizures, they split the corpus callosum. And your brain can largely still function, but there are some issues with connecting information. Okay, so they did the experiment again, and what they saw was that this time, categorical perception effect happened in the right visual field with the left hemisphere, just like in the initial one, but it didn't happen at all in the right hemisphere with the left visual field. And this seems to indicate that maybe this really is a question of communicating between the hemispheres, because if you cut them and they can't communicate anymore and the effect disappears, that seems to indicate that this language thing is really important and really integral. But what if we don't have language? There's a whole class of people on this earth that don't have language. Anybody know? Any ideas?
Yeah, so. Wait, no, that's not true.
Jenna, I gave you 4 practice talks. You should know this.
Infants?
Infants don't have language.
But they're not human.
They're not born with language. They don't learn language. Okay, so this is another way to zero in on this language acquisition effect. Okay, so if we study babies and they don't have categorical perception, then maybe that indicates that language really does dictate it. That once you learn language, that's when the change takes place, and that's why we distinguish these categories. So they did it. They tested babies. They tested babies, and they found a couple interesting things. The first thing that they found was that babies do exhibit categorical perception. So babies still distinguish, back to that first experiment, the blue and the green, they will distinguish that differently than they will distinguish 2 greens, even if they're equally spaced. So wait a second, does that mean that categorical perception is not linguistic? Didn't we just agree that it is? This is really troubling for our experiment, right? So they found that babies have categorical perception. But what's interesting is that the hemisphere effect is switched in babies. Okay? So for adults that have language, the left hemisphere, the right visual field, responds faster. In babies, it's the other way around. The left visual field, the right hemisphere. This is where the categorical perception effect is strongest. So this is just a little representation of the data for the babies. So The y-axis here is the amount of time it took them to respond. And in the baby experiment, I should say, they don't have the left and right clickers because babies can't do that. So they did the same setup with the circles, and one of them, with the circle of colors, and one of them was different, and they just measured the amount of time it took the baby's eyes to move to the target, which indicates that they noticed that something was different, right? Okay, so we see here the white bar here in the left visual field. The right bar is the within category, so that's 2 greens or 2 blues. And then the shaded one is between categories, so a green and a blue. And it took much less time for them to distinguish a between category pair than it did for a within category pair. There's a huge difference here. Huge, relatively, because it's milliseconds, but relatively huge difference. And it does not take place in the right visual field, which is controlled by the left side. Okay? So this all supports the idea that there is something going on with language that affects the way that we perceive this color. They actually repeated the experiment with toddlers who were actually in the process of learning language. And what they saw was that the toddlers who were able to understand what the word blue meant and what the word green meant responded to the experiment much like the adults who have learned language, and the ones who are not yet able to do that responded like the infants. So this all supports the idea that, first of all, we have categorical perception happening primarily in one visual field, so that maybe has a link to this hemisphere thing, and that something changes when you learn language. Something shifts in your brain, which supports the idea that language is going to affect this. But wait, we just said that babies still have categorical perception even when they don't have language. So what does that mean? Where do these categories come from? If they can still distinguish categories differently, doesn't that mean that categories are not linguistic? What's the deal? So what they think with the interpretation of these results was that maybe what's happening is we have some sort of pre-linguistic basis for categories, right? Something that doesn't have to do with language, something that babies can perceive, something that's pre-linguistic, and that serves as sort of a starting point for the way that we build language off of that. So we've got pre-linguistic categories, if that's true. We've got a pre-linguistic category. We build language as a result of these categories, and we sort of build them off of that. But once we build the language and we start to use it, something happens in the brain, and the way that we perceive color switches. Something shifts physiologically in the brain. So this gives a model where where actually in a way both the universalists and the relativists are right. So the universalists are right in that there is some sort of non-linguistic basis, but the relativists are right as well because it shows that some sort of switches happen and something is being affected by language. They repeated these studies with people who speak other languages. For example, one really interesting study, actually with both Greek and Russian, this is the case. In both of these languages, the colors light blue and dark blue. So in English, they're both called blue. They're just called light blue or dark blue. In Greek and Russian, there are actually completely different linguistic terms for them. So there's a whole different word for light blue than there is for dark blue. And they ran experiments on them. What they showed was that people who natively speak Greek and Russian perceive light blue and dark blue differently than for example, English speakers do. They did similar experiments with Korean speakers, which have different language color boundaries as well. Okay, so here's where it gets really, really weird and really awesome. Okay, so most of us in our eyes have structures called cones, and we have 3 of them, 3 different kinds of cones. And cones are what allow us to process color. That's one of the structures that allows us to process color. Most of us are what are called trichromats because we have 3 different kinds of cones. And these cones dictate the spectrum of colors that we can see. If you're missing a cone, you're called a dichromat. That's what we think of as colorblind people. They're missing a cone. There's actually a small percentage of people who are all women for genetic reasons. There's a small percentage of women who are what's called tetrachromats, which means that they have a 4th cone. They have an extra cone that in their eyes that allow them, that theoretically allow them to see more colors than normal people can. So this is just sort of a scale of how many colors you can see with these kinds of cones. So dichromats can see about 10,000 colors. They can distinguish about 10,000 colors. Trichromats can distinguish roughly 1 million different colors, which is already a lot of colors. Tetrachromats, if they can see the extra colors that their cones allow them, can see up to 100 million different colors. These are humans that can see this. So this is really amazing that this is even possible, that there are human beings on this earth that can see entire colors, like lots and lots of colors, that normal people can't see, that most of us aren't able to some of them can process extra colors, but some of them actually can't do this at all. Some of them have, in essence, a dead structure. It's an extrachrome that does absolutely nothing to alter the amount of colors that they can see. So why would this be? Why is it that some of them can see the extra colors and some of them can't see the extra colors? Well, if it's true that language shapes our ability to perceive color, maybe the fact that these tetrachromats grow up in a culture and speak a language that's constructed by trichromats, and we don't have linguistic terms for these extra colors that they can see, that may, if language affects color perception, that may actually affect their ability to perceive these colors at all. So it's not just that they don't know what to call them, or they don't know how to communicate that to us. They may actually not be able to see them at all because they grew up in this speaking this language that has no terms for them, which is an insane possibility. And it leads to a lot of really maybe troubling, maybe fascinating, depending on your outlook, questions about what to do with this information, right? So what else might be affected by language? If language shapes the way that we see the world when we look out into it, what else are we missing when we look out in the world? We think, this is very counterintuitive, because we look out in the world and we think that we pretty much just are people. We go out and we see exactly what's there, and then we know the world because we went out and we looked at it. This might not be the case. We might be missing a lot of information because of the way that we use language and because of the way that we categorize things. They actually ran similar experiments with other types of visual perception other than color, so shape recognition and things like that, and that seemed to show similar effects. So what are we not seeing that's could be out there? And the converse, what might we be constructing that isn't quote unquote out there in the world? How might our language actually be constructing parts of our visual perception that might not be there otherwise? And lastly, as language changes, which it absolutely does, language evolves over time. Particularly right now, we're in an age with the rise of technology. Language is changing very quickly, and the way that we use it is changing very quickly. So if language shapes our perception and language is changing really quickly, how might the way that we perceive the world when we look at it be changing as well? And how might that compare to 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years from now? What might be different in the way that we look out in the world and we see things? So the point of this for me, what's most striking about this is what's been most striking about most of the neuroscience that I've studied recently is that it seems like what's really happening with us is active sensing, okay? So what we seem to intuit is happening is what you might call passive sensing, which is what I said about I go out in the world and sensation happens to me. I just process it and there are stimuli bombarding me and I just take them as they are. What seems to be actually happening is something more like active sensing. If this is true, I am shaping what I see when I look out into the world. My sensation is not just something that happens to me, it's something that I take part in, and I help to construct my reality, which is what Jenna was talking about with her power of positive thinking. That's a voluntary way that you might choose to do that. But it seems to run even deeper than those voluntary ways. It's something that's built into the way that we function already, that we actively construct a narrative of what we're seeing when we look out into the world. And so neuroscience is basically going to have to come to grips with this idea that we can't just know about the world by knowing, we can't just know that we can go out in the world and perceive the world and know information about it directly as pure sensation, okay? What the model that we're looking at more and more in neuroscience is a model of active sensing, that we have to look at ourselves and the way that we process information if we can really know more about what we know about the world and